You know, when you look at and you graph out Christian spirituality, I always say there are 4 non-negotiable pillars to Christian spirituality. They constitute the foundation of Christian spirituality. Okay, now, what are they? We'll take them one at a time. Private prayer and private morality, and that includes charity. See, so that, Jesus makes this pretty clear. Jesus says, if anyone loves me, they will keep my word. See, so private morality, private prayer, private charity, that's not a negotiable thing, And sometimes, we can delude ourselves that justice alone is enough. I remember a young man I worked with when I was in grad school in San Francisco, and I was living at a youth hostel and helping there. I need help out sometimes. Very dedicated young man, but his Christian morality wasn't always, what his mother would have approved of, But he used to tell me, he says, you think that God really cares, whether you, break the 6th commandment or whether you say your morning prayers or go to church or whatever. You think God gives a care about that? I say, he couldn't care. These are big things. We're trying to save the planet, and you're worried about whether you go to church. I said, think God cares about little things? Yes, God does. God cares about everything. With God, it's little things and big things. So Scripture is pretty clear, Christian discipleship starts with private prayer and private morality. But secondly, it also commands us to justice for the poor. I'm going to give you some numbers here, and they might startle you. If you go into the New Testament and you would simply take every time the poor are mentioned, you would find that it's every 10th line of the entire New Testament. And in the Gospels, in Luke's Gospel, every 6th line in Luke's Gospel would have to do with the poor. In the Epistle of St. James, it's every 5th line. And what Jim Wallace sometimes does in retreats, he gives people a cheap Bible and a razor blade. Said, I want you to go through the Bible during the weekend and cut out every reference to the poor. You know what happens? The whole thing falls apart. It doesn't hold together. So that's symbolic. It's a metaphor. But if you take the poor out of the Scripture, it doesn't hold together. Mr. Wallace says, any gospel that isn't good news for the poor is not the gospel of Jesus. It's his first opening statement. I've come to bring good news to the poor. Now, part of that is also justice. In Canada, we have a program called Cross Country Checkup, And so every Sunday, actually, it's one of the great radio programs we have, and so that they take a topic, and for 2 hours, people phone in from around the country, And so one Sunday I was driving, and they had the program, the question of churches, and just kind of that tension between justice and charity, And the man they had, they always have a couple of people in the studio, and one of them was Archbishop Remy de Roux, from Victoria, who had been he's retired now, he's probably 90, but who has been a great figure of social justice in Canada, kind of our Bishop Hurley. So some lady phoned in, and she said to him, she says, she said, our priest, she said, I'm a Catholic. She said, you're a Catholic. She said, our priest, he's always talking about social justice, social justice, social justice. And she said, isn't that just something that the liberation theologians invented, And now they're trying to foist it on us. She said, why justice, 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 And so Remy de Roux said, well, what would you say if you had a priest who said, private morality and the 6th commandment and prayer, that's just something that the nuns invented, and they're trying to push onto the whole church. She said, well, I would have the priest suspend it, So de Roux said, well, you should have the priest suspend it too if he won't preach about social justice. They're both non-negotiable in Scripture. Jesus calls us to charity, and Jesus calls us to justice, And again, I said, a lot of people do one or the other, So I know some people are pretty just, but they're not very charitable. I know some people who are truly charitable. They are wonderful people, give you the shirt off their back, but they won't look at systems, See, that's a gap in our discipleship. But then, not only that, it's charity, and then justice, but then also a commitment inside of an ecclesial community. This hasn't got to do with what we're talking about tonight, but it's a prong of discipleship. And that is Christianity. Let me put it to you this way. Christianity is not something you do alone. Christianity is a religion you do with other people. It's interesting. You can, if you study world religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Islam to a point, and so on, you can do them alone. You can be a good Buddhist alone. You can't be a good Christian or even a good Jew alone. Judaism and Christianity, by essence, they're religions we do together. We're called to come to God in a group, which is frustrating. If you go on a tour, it's so nice to go by yourself. You can eat when you want, stay where you want, stop where you want. When you're on a group outing, it is a pain, But as Christians, we're here on a group outing, we're called to come to God in a community, So Christianity is constitutively communitarian. That's why when someone says, I'm spiritual but not religious, that can be very true, but it can't be true for a Christian. You can be a good spiritual person, but if you're a Christian, Christianity by essence demands some type of communitarian church involvement. So you can't be a good Christian and not, however you define church, but you have to have some kind of ecclesial community that you journey with. Otherwise, we're not Christian. In fact, today a lot of people worry about heresy. I think said the biggest heresy in Christianity today is what I call a viral heresy. So it's not a dogmatic heresy, a viral heresy. This virus that somehow we don't have to do it together. And that's partly predicated in Western society where, the reason why we struggle so much with community in churches because we struggle so much with community, period. It's true for society. Neighbors don't know each other anymore. Neighbors don't care about each other. We don't have neighborhoods, so we don't have parishes either. People, today we want to have church and community on our own terms. Reginald Bibby, who's a wonderful sociologist of religion, a Baptist in Canada, but he's our major tracker of religion for 40 years. And Bibby has this soundbite. He says, people are treating their churches in exact same ways as they're treating their families, which means they want them around, but not much. See, your kids, they don't want you to disappear or die, but they don't want you interfering with their life very much. They'll call you when they want you. And that's why so few people go to church regularly. They don't want their churches to disappear. Have the church there. When we need it, we'll call you, But see, that's a societal problem. We're adult children of René Descartes. Remember René Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Descartes said, what's the only thing you can be sure that's real? He's right. It's you, because you're inside of you. You're real. Your headaches are real. Your heartaches are real. Your issues are real. And you may be dreaming everything else. Okay, that's new in history, and it's also not true in a lot of other cultures. But we're radically individualistic in Western society, which brings many benefits. We have all this great freedom and so on, but we really struggle with community, family, and stuff at every level. And we struggle with church. But Christianity, you can't, if you're a Christian, you can't say, I'm spiritual but not religious. You got to be spiritual and religious. Christianity, community comes with the package. Okay. And then the last one, if somebody were a person of wonderful private prayer, charity, private morality, social justice, goes to church, what's still missing? A very important part. A mellow and gracious heart. Because, as T.S. Eliot, remember T.S. Eliot, great poet. In English, probably the best religious poet of the last century. And T.S. Eliot says, the last temptation that's the greatest treason is to do the right thing for the wrong reason. So I'll give you an example. The older brother of the prodigal son, notice what he says to his father, I stayed home. I've been completely faithful. I've never left you. I've done all the work. But notice he can't go into his Father's house. The Father's house is heaven. He's standing outside the gates of heaven because he's bitter. He's angry. Notice he's done everything right, but his energy is all wrong. See, we can do everything right and have all the wrong energy, and we're not there. So, and it's interesting, I was first alerted to this by the liberation theologians. Gustavo Gutierrez was the first person I ever heard that from. And then Thomas Merton. They'd say, it's not enough just to have your life right. You have to have your heart right. And the heart has to be right with Jesus. It's got to be mellow and gracious. You know, I want to tell you a great story on this. And I ended up in the Holy Longing. But in 1985, and I was still a young theologian, just starting at that time, and I went to Belgium in the summer for a conference on world church. And this conference was organized by Christiane Brusselmans. And many of you remember that name. She's the woman who almost single-handedly revised the RCIA and the church. She's a wonderful, gracious theologian. But anyway, she set together this institute on world church. And she brought together 40 people from all over the world, from every continent, and they were divided into groups. So at every continent had a group of about 8 people, you know, and then they would speculate about world church and the poor and poverty and ecclesiology and so on. Now, I wasn't a participant. I was brought there to be a secretary for group 2. So I'm supposed to write up this thing and so on. But in our group 2, very interesting, people from all over the world, and we had a nun from the Philippines, a young nun, and she could have been Mother Teresa's younger sister. I mean, this is a nun you order from a catalog, okay? Okay. She had everything. She was young. She was completely dedicated to the poor, you know. She was a woman of deep prayer, you know, and charity and so on. And she described to the group, like, she said, I have a real radical, you know, lifestyle. She said, I don't sleep on a bed. She said, I try to be in solidarity with the poor. So she sleeps on a straw mattress. And, you know, she has a special diet, and everything is to be in this radical solidarity with the poor. And she's a woman of deep prayer. Obviously goes to church, goes to Mass every day. So this is what happened. We were meeting in a retreat center outside of the city of Bruges. The retreat center was less palatial than the ORC. it was okay, but you know, it wasn't exactly, you know, we weren't living high off the hog, you know. But also we were working really hard. So Christiane Brussels, the first days we were going sessions morning, afternoon, and evening. And by Thursday, this started Sunday, we were pretty tired. So come Thursday noon, Christiane came in and she rang a bell and she said, you've all been working too hard. So this afternoon, she said, we're going to have congé, you know, in French. That's it, just free time, you know, this is going to be celebration, fiesta, you'd say here, you know. So she said, you have about half an hour, go to your rooms, put on blue jeans and running shoes and get some straw hats, and we're going to take a bus, we're going to take you into Bruges, which is the Venice of the North. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. Said, and we want you to spend the afternoon just drinking and shopping and enjoying yourself. Said, then at 7 o'clock, we'll meet in the Hall of the Inn, and we're going to have an exquisite meal because you deserve it. Well, it was the biggest crisis for the whole thing, you know. Some people said, well, this is an insult to the poor. Like, you know, we're here to talk about the poor, and we're going to do all this stuff and so on. And but we did it. And we went and we met at the Hall of the Inn at 7 o'clock, and it was a wonderful meal for about 3 hours with silver forks and wine and so on. Well, the last day, when we ended with a Eucharist, and at the end they had an open microphone. They said, if you have a conversion experience, just share it with the group. So a lot of people, mostly from the first world, will go up and say, like, I had this conversion to see people from other worlds who are struggling with poverty, struggling with their problems. I realized, you know, how pampered and spoiled I am as a Westerner and so on. But at a certain point, our young Filipino nun went up and took the microphone. And she said, I also had a conversion experience. In a way I didn't dream I needed ever to be converted. It said it happened with that going to Bruges. She said, from the second it was announced that I froze up and I was angry. And I thought, this is an insult to the dignity of the poor. And I'm here on the patrimony of the poor, and we're going to dine and go and shopping and so on. She said, but I believe in community. She said, so I went along. So I went along to stay with the community. She said, but I was miserable the whole afternoon. She says, and a couple of women befriended me, and they kind of dragged me along. She said, and I had my first drink of gin and tonic ever. And on a terrible thing. She said, and I went along. She said, but I was miserable. She said, and it culminated. She said, I walked into the Holiday Inn, and I saw like the linen napkins and knives and forks. She says, I nauseated. I literally nauseated. Said, I couldn't stay there. She said, I went and I sat on the bus. But she'd sat on the bus for about 3 hours while we ate. So I was sitting in the bus, and I was so angry, and I thought to myself, would Jesus be in there eating and drinking? So I had a horrible realization, he would. And he would be thoroughly enjoying himself. So then I realized that John the Baptist would be on the bus with me, eating grasshoppers and saying they're all going to go to hell, Said I realized that John all mixed up with Jesus, So I realized there's something not right in my heart yet, Gutierrez always says, he used to say, if you want to come to Latin America when he's still living here, and help us, he said, if you watch your television set and you get angry, say, this isn't right. We have all this wealth and therefore, you want to come. He said, don't come. He said, we have many problems without importing your neurosis and unhappiness. He said, don't come if you're angry. He said, if you are grateful for what God has done for you, he said, come, it'll be wonderful. When I was a student in Belgium, I went one Christmas to spend a Christmas in working with Sister Emmanuel. She was the kind of Mother Teresa of Cairo, one with a couple of Canadian philosophy students and so on. She was a marvelous woman. She was a Sister of Zion, and she lived in a hut with the garbage collectors, and the people would come and make their living collecting garbage and so on. But a lot of young people from around the world would come and join her to help work there. And she had this rule. As soon as you got angry, she'd send you home. When I was there was a young woman from Winnipeg, and she got all angry and fired up. And Sister Emmanuel sent her home and said, no, it's not, you don't need to be here right now. See, like Gutierrez says, you got to do all this stuff, but it's got to come from graciousness. It's got to come from a mellow heart. Daniel Berrigan, if you can't love the people, if you're going to hate the people who arrest you, then don't do it. The world doesn't need another angry person. We got lots of anger out there, You're going to see that's going to be the real burden of prophecy. To do it in love, to do it in charity, to do it with humor, and to a mellow, gracious heart. Tell a story of Thomas Merton. They said during the Selma, Alabama march, some young minister came to him and he says, I am so angry and I'm full. He said, I'm just so angry. I want to do something. He said, what should I do? And Merton said, you shouldn't do anything. He said, go have a beer. He said, deal with your anger. He said, and then go and try to help with the poor, Now, that's a little bit too slick. Sometimes, Jim Wallace says, sometimes we have to act ourselves into a new way of thinking or act ourselves into a new way of feeling, so that, sometimes we, which comes first, Sometimes we think something through and then it leads to action, a change of thought leads to action. Sometimes just the action leads to a change of thought. Sometimes we have to act ourselves into a new way of thinking. Or sometimes we have to act ourselves into a new way of feeling, For instance, parents do that sometimes, When you have your first child, you don't know how it's going to affect you. All of a sudden you have a baby, and all of a sudden you think and feel really differently. You didn't think this out. You acted in a certain way, and then it changed the whole way you think. So sometimes serving the poor is a way of getting rid of your anger, So Merton, that's a little bit too slick. Say, first get unangry, then serve the poor. Sometimes the way you're going to get unangry is by going serving the poor, and so on. So but those four go together. A healthy Christian discipleship, private prayer, private morality, charity, and justice for systems. Some kind of ecclesial commitment. You got to be involved in some kind of church. And then mellowness and graciousness of heart. Otherwise, we can be the older brother, the prodigal son. Notice, he's doing everything right, but it's all wrong. Because his heart is bitter and angry.